Speaker, when the High Court ruled in mid-2003 on the Ngāti Apa case, it set off a chain of events which has vexed successive governments ever since. And I recall back in 2003 a very strong public mood emerging that said very clearly that the foreshore and seabed belonged to every New Zealander. It was part of our inalienable birthright. And I led a public march in Nelson to that effect at that time. And I said, because some have tried to throw this quote back at me, I said then that if we legislated for differential rights for differing groups of the New Zealand population, we were starting down the path to separatism and anarchy. And I hold to that view today. And what's interesting is that in its response to the court's decision at that time, the previous government, in good faith, started the development of legislation that would recognise the foreshore and seabed as public domain held for all New Zealanders. And United Future worked closely with Dr Michael Cullen and Prime Minister Clark to develop that legislation in that 2003-4 period. Now, somewhere along the way, to quote Harold Macmillan, the Labour Party ran into a little local difficulties and effectively lost its numbers, which meant that the combination of the United Future members of Parliament and the Labour Party members of Parliament were no longer a majority in this House. And in March 2004, having put before both its own caucus and our caucus a bill that vested the foreshore and seabed into public domain, the Labour Party suddenly found, for reasons which were internal to it, that it needed to bring on board some others to get the numbers. And those others were in the form of New Zealand First. The White Knight from Tauranga, as he then was, came charging over the horizon. Do you remember the ads in the newspapers, standing coyly on the beaches, having saved them? The price of his intervention was to remove any reference to public domain from the legislation. We pulled our support at that point, and what that change did, that intervention of New Zealand First, was set in place the tension that has been there ever since, which this bill today finally repeals. Because the concept of Crown ownership was an insertion of something that was never there before. It created the possibility of the Crown as landlord. The Crown could privatise the foreshore and seabed. The Crown could limit access. The Crown could sell it. A public domain concept which saw every one of us having an equal and inalienable and indivisible right of ownership mitigated against that happening. But thanks to New Zealand First, we ended up at the end of 2004 with legislation that asserted for the first time ever explicit, specific and sole Crown ownership of the foreshore and seabed, gave birth to the Maori Party and set in place an issue that has festered ever since. Now, at the time that that legislation was passed, many claims were made similar to those being made now, that any form of settlement, any form of recognition of customary title would see people excluded from the beaches, would see the traditional access we'd all assumed we enjoyed done away with. Well, a bit like Chicken Licken, Mr Speaker, the sky has not fallen in subsequently. We have learned to live collaboratively, constructively and positively alongside each other, and New Zealanders still go to the beach in throngs every summer, and their rights have not been impeded. The festering sore was the issue of Crown ownership. And when the matter came back onto the agenda in 2009, the Attorney-General, the Maori Party and others started to look at options for resolving that issue that would not diminish those rights that had hitherto been enjoyed by all New Zealanders. And that is where the modern version, if you like, of public domain, shared space, comes into play. And what the Minister is doing is recognising the point that Helen Clark recognised way back in 2003, that Michael Cullen recognised then, and would love to have legislated for, that old English notion of the Commons still is relevant today and still provides the solution to this issue in an enduring and permanent way and relieves a lot of the tension that has been associated with it. Mr. Speaker, I listened to the Deputy Prime Minister, and he made a point, I think, that is interesting in terms of the opposition to this bill. There has been a lot of it. I've received hundreds, if not thousands, of emails. Many are well-meant. Most are, dare I say it, misinformed. Some are downright malicious, and others, particularly those emanating from the Coastal Coalition, are simple racist lies. The point at issue here, Mr. Speaker, is that this is an issue that New Zealanders want some settlement and some finality to. And what we are doing today by actually reasserting the concept of shared space is giving that certainty and that determination that we all thought was there in 2003 and that would have been there in 2004 were it not for Mr. Peters once again saving the nation. What a legacy that man has to look back on. New Zealand over the last 15, 20 years has spent most of its time fixing up messes that he has been party to creating. And this is another one of those. So, Mr. Speaker, I say to New Zealanders that the traditional view we've always had about every one of us having that right of access is secured in this bill. The traditional view we've always had about, if you like, the ease with which we can achieve those rights of access, that ability to go to the beach in colloquial terms, is secured in this bill, because actually those provisions are not substantially different from what's in the current legislation. What has been removed is a concept that was inserted very late in 2004 and has simply subsequently been the cause of most of the division associated with this legislation. The foreshore and seabed belongs to all of us. This bill finally puts that in place. Now, Mr. Speaker, when one reviews the scope of the last 7 or 8 years, in retrospect it might have been easier simply to let the courts resolve this matter way back in 2003. But there was no great confidence at the time in their ability to do so in a way that was fair to the interests of all New Zealanders. There was no great confidence that that would achieve a fair and reasonable outcome. The member opposite last was probably still at school at that time. But the reality is that the interests of New Zealanders were protected by the government seeking to act. The problem was that external intervention caused a situation where its legislation was derailed. What this bill does today is effectively pick up where we all thought we were in 2004, put in place a durable solution and ensure that all of the views that the disparate interests have had, I find it incidentally very interesting that the coalition of the opposition stretches from those who say the foreshore and seabed should be exclusively the reserve of Maori, right through to those who say that this is simply handing everything over to Maori. This is a coalition of extremes. Middle ground New Zealand opinion simply wants to be able to get on with life the way it always was. This bill, the concept of shared space, achieves that goal. That is why I am supporting it.
The Honourable